Hey, what's up, everybody? Sorry for coming at y'all just late, whatever. I got a quick video. This here is a bad, quite frankly, goes into the bad teacher category. Let's get it.
A lot of customers told us they need a fiber laser. So we
Sorry
take
about
this
the
challenge.
ad.
We want to create the best thing.
A high school teacher allegedly turned her classroom into a drug lounge. THC, nicotine, skip classes. It's crazy. Miranda Burton Stone, a South Carolina educator, is now behind bars for allegedly creating a shocking hub of illegal activity. And we're going to break down everything we know about this wild case and more. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. This is a case that is just so mind-boggling. You may be asking yourself, what, another alleged bad teacher? Possibly, yes. South Carolina, you got this high school teacher who's now behind bars, accused of turning her classroom essentially into a hub for vaping nicotine and THC while letting students skip class to hang out. Miranda Burton Stone, a former teacher at Lawrence District 55 High School in South Carolina, was taken into custody on Tuesday, facing multiple charges, including unlawfully placing a child at risk of harm and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. And these shocking allegations first came to light on February 28th, when, according to the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office, the school's resource officer noticed what was going on and reported Stone's behavior to authorities. Now, Stone allegedly allowed students to use nicotine and THC, which is the psychoactive compound in marijuana, during school hours. She also reportedly let students skip their regular classes to stay in her classroom. This was essentially a party environment. And obviously, this raised serious concerns about her role as an educator. According to an official statement from the sheriff's office, quote, an investigation began and various interviews were conducted. The employee, Stone, was relieved of her duties while the investigation was conducted and subsequently terminated on March 4th, 2025. Now, this is a deeply troubling case because, as we've talked about many times here on Sidebar, educators, they are entrusted with the safety, the well-being of our children, and this behavior, if true, is a clear violation of that trust. Now, here's what's interesting about Stone. She wasn't a teacher who taught a particular subject or grade. As a matter of fact, this is ironic, maybe not, deputies revealed that she was an in-school suspension teacher. So this is a teacher who is tasked specifically with supervising students with
Woman?
disciplinary issues, who are serving an in-school suspension as opposed to one at home. And in this role, the teacher is supposed to monitor the coursework of the students, work with them to address bad behavior that led to the suspension, even offering strategies to help improve their conduct. You see why this is kind of weird? Now, before we go any further into this, I want to bring on somebody who can help break all this down with me. I want to bring on criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor Jeremy Elridge to talk about this. Jeremy, thanks so much for coming on here on Sidebar. I mean, can I just start your thoughts on this? It seems like every time I cover a story about a teacher accused of acting badly, it's like each headline is more shocking than the next. What do you make of this one?
First off, you're completely right. Deterrence obviously does not work with teachers as it relates to punishment. It doesn't matter how many teachers are prosecuted for various acts, whether it's engaging in sexual acts with a student or allowing for rampant drug use. Obviously, deterrence just doesn't work. There's so much to unpack here. How many kids were using? What were they using? Who actually observed it? How long has this been going on? I mean, there's just so much to unpack here, which we'll learn about during the prosecution of this case.
Is that what the investigation looks like? When you hear the school doing an internal investigation or police doing an investigation, what does that look like?
It usually starts with the SRO, the school resource officer, which oftentimes is either what's called a special police officer, maybe someone that received training, specialized training through the school system, or a retired police officer from that district. A lot of these individuals may be veterans. And so a lot of the time it starts with a small complaint that's being investigated. When we get to a higher level issue, sexual acts, rampant drug use or drug dealing, usually at that point the county police are brought in to investigate, interview children, pull any security footage. In most schools now, we know, are equipped with CCTV footage, and that's what's being analyzed right now. The question in my mind is going to be, what actually exists? What is the universe of evidence here to prosecute this teacher outside of saying that she saw and allowed everything?
They have to interview the students, right? Do they test them for being drug use? Do they test them? Do they take blood tests? I mean, how do they prove?
How does that work
at that time? And what do those interviews look like?
So that's a great question. Factually, we are unable to use technology. With the advent of technology, it really just hasn't caught up to where we are to prosecute drug cases. So unlike a DUI, where you can be given a preliminary breath test roadside to determine the presence of alcohol, or take a blood test at the station, or take a blood test or a breath test at the station, and there's some finality or more certainty to that. Even if you do a hair test or a urine test, all it shows is the presence of marijuana in your body. It doesn't give us any real scientific evidence or biological evidence that would show that someone was using marijuana at the time. So scientific evidence probably won't play a role here. What will play a role here is the testimony of all of the students who were in the room, testimony of other teachers, testimony of the SRO, the camera footage showing kids going
testimony
in
and camera
That's
footage.
mostly going to be the direct and circumstantial evidence that the prosecution will be looking to collect and examine.
The disappearance of baby Lisa Irwin has been a mystery for more than a decade. Who took her from her crib in the middle of the night? And could she possibly still be alive? Megyn Kelly is taking you back inside the case in a special new 5-part series, Megyn Kelly Investigates. She interviews baby Lisa's parents, other key players in the case, and through hidden cameras brings the first ever comments from one of the men at the center of the story. Deep reporting, expert analysis, Megyn Kelly Investigates on the disappearance of baby Lisa. All 5 episodes are available now on the Megyn Kelly Show's YouTube channel and podcast feed, and you can also find out more at megynkelly.com. Talk to me about how these charges fit. So we're talking unlawfully placing a child at risk of or cause harm, 4 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and providing tobacco to a minor under 18. Talk to me how these charges apply to this set of facts.
Let's start with the easiest one, which is the providing tobacco to a minor. Unless this teacher actually purchased and or distributed, and you don't need what we would call consideration under the law or remuneration. You don't need payment for these things. So unless the teacher actually distributed and gave these children tobacco to use, I don't think that her actions as we know of them now are going to fly under the law. That feels like a not guilty. But when we're looking at some of the other charges, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, all you have to
she's guilty of that one.
In custody of the child, which a teacher would be, that they allow the child to engage in arguably criminal behavior, which would be the use of a controlled dangerous substance like marijuana that is unlawful in South Carolina, unlike other states, or the use of tobacco by a minor, which is also unlawful. That in and of itself enough would constitute sufficient evidence to be found guilty under that statute, as well as the statute regarding child neglect, because they're very similar elements that are.
Do you need to prove intent?
You don't need to prove an intent. You have to prove knowledge. So if you're sitting in a classroom and these kids are vaping in front of you and you're not doing anything, that is likely sufficient evidence. A lot of these statutes don't require a specific intent, meaning I meant for something to happen and I intended for it to happen. They require a general intent. Did you intend to do what you did? Meaning you sitting at the desk and not paying attention, that could be essentially enough, or sticking your head in the sand, falling asleep while kids are using drugs, or you're using nicotine. That in and of itself could constitute sufficient evidence for a conviction.
Are you suggesting that if this were to go to trial, this would be fought, that the defense would be, I didn't know the students were doing this in the classroom? Is that an avenue for the defense to explore?
100%. In fact, I could see a situation where we learned later that the case is incredibly defensible. For instance, what makes more sense? And just given your own time spending in high school, right? Do you have kids? Is it more likely that these kids were sneaking off to the bathroom, going in parts of a classroom because we don't know what the geography of the classroom was? Was it all visible to the teacher? Were they going to use drugs in these areas and the teacher just didn't have knowledge of it? Or were they actually vaping in front of the teacher and the teacher had knowledge of it? But if the camera footage in the classroom or outside of the classroom or other witnesses say, yeah, these kids were just sneaking off all the time, or they were with their head under the table, and there's no way to show that the teacher actually had knowledge of what was going on, the case may be more defensible than anyone wants to admit.
What are the potential consequences that Stone might be facing? My understanding, at least, the unlawful charge, that's a felony. So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but she could be facing prison time here, right?
Oh, 100%. With regard to the charges of the neglect charges or contributing to the delinquency of a minor, those are felonies. They can carry upwards of 10 years in jail. Do I think she's going to do 10 years in jail? Not a chance. But could she serve some jail time, the 6 months to a year, if she has no criminal record? Of course. The distribution of tobacco charge is really just a finable offense. It feels like a bit of a throwaway charge here and somewhat unnecessary. I have a feeling as this case evolves, we could see the evolution or changing of charges, the modification of the charges. Prosecutors sometimes don't want to spend time proving a lower level charge that doesn't have any teeth to it, instead of focusing on the primary charge here, which would be, did she engage in activity that affected the welfare of the child? And that's where the state should be focusing their case.
And as a former prosecutor, how would you build this case? I mean, obviously you don't have the full facts, right? But you would want to make sure that she was the one. I guess the question would be, does she have to supply a lot of this to the students, just allow it to happen? How would you structure a case like this against her?
The first thing you need to know is what actually happened inside of that classroom. And no charging decisions in this case should be made until you understand the full universe of evidence. Are kids going to come into this classroom and say that there was rampant and open drug use in that classroom? And are kids willing to testify to that? And if they are, then you prosecute those two more serious charges that we discussed. But if you don't have kids that are going to testify against that teacher, or an admission or confession by the teacher herself that she supplied some of these drugs or she was aware of the use and just let it happen, then the case is going to be very difficult to prosecute, because this is the type of circumstantial case that you can lose in trial. If it's not open air in the classroom and you have kids sneaking out to the bathroom, how could you possibly prove that the teacher had any knowledge whatsoever or any intent? And by that point, it sounds bad in the paper, but it's going to sound worse for the prosecution in the courtroom.
Is this a case that you think that she would plead guilty to, work out, negotiate some sort of appropriate sentence, or do you think this is a case that would advance towards trial?
Her decisions in this case are going to be affected by her own actions, but if she kept her mouth shut and invoked her Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, then maybe she has a stronger defense. She's going to need to know, too, much like the prosecution, what the universe of evidence is. If they don't have witnesses that are going to testify against her and she didn't confess, that sounds like a trial to me, because we both know her job's in jeopardy, her pension could be in jeopardy, and she could have some significant collateral consequences as a result of taking a plea here.
Does she face any federal liability, any federal charges that you can think of?
Is there an argument that she could face federal prosecution? Potentially. Is this a case that federal prosecutors are going to want to sink their teeth into? I can't imagine it. This is not of the ilk of cases that the U.S. Attorney's Office would look at in any state, simply because this is something that is well within the jurisdiction of the local prosecutor's office, and frankly, they're more equipped to handle.
I am curious about the school, because, look, my understanding is, under the law, the school would have an obligation to make sure that they provide a safe environment for students. They can't allow a classroom to be used as a party zone where drugs are allegedly abused. But also, under the, and correct me if I'm wrong, federally, under the Controlled Substances Act, you have THC, which is classified as a Schedule 1 controlled substance.
Federal charge.
Having no accepted medical use, high potential for abuse. But the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, my understanding, requires schools that receive federal funding to maintain a drug-free environment. And it is my understanding that Lawrence District 55 governs public schools, so in theory they could be receiving federal funding.
And they do.
In violation of this act. Am I thinking about this?
And they do, and the reason I know this is because I myself graduated from this particular high school. So yes, I know for a fact that this school does get federal funding.
Right way?
You're 100% thinking about this the right way. What we've seen at schools like Columbia University for potential discrimination claims, what we saw in President Trump's 2016 presidency was the removal of funds from schools in Chicago for not taking sexual assault investigations seriously. So what you're suggesting, that the federal government, led by President Trump, and not tolerating drug use in schools, is not terribly far-fetched. We've already seen a willingness from Washington, D.C. to engage in the clawing back of funds for school districts that he feels are not operating correctly. Now, is this likely to happen under President Biden? Probably not. But because we've seen it before with President Trump and we've seen these threats with universities now, it's a distinct possibility.
Interesting. Now, by the way, this is not an isolated incident. And unfortunately, these kinds of things happen more than you think, especially if you follow us here on Sidebar, because across the country, educators have been accused of endangering students.
Ultrafire cervical care pillow. Even orthopedic doctors are using it. Orthopedic expert recommendation.
Especially if you follow us here on Sidebar, because across the country, educators have been accused of endangering students in very shocking ways. I want to actually take a look at some recent, more alarming cases. So the first one that we've actually discussed on a previous episode of Sidebar is this one that happened in Cocoa Beach, Florida, where an elementary school principal and a teacher were arrested in January after allegedly hosting a wild party at the principal's home. Over 100 minors attended the party where alcohol, marijuana, they were reportedly consumed. One teen was even allegedly found vomiting and shaking on the front lawn, required medical attention. According to the arrest affidavit, Elizabeth Hill Brodigan, the 47-year-old principal of Roosevelt Elementary School, initially apparently told police that she would handle the situation and shut down the music by 10 p.m. However, when officers arrived later that night, they apparently found a chaotic scene. Coolers filled with alcohol scattered around the yard, teens openly drinking, some even wearing matching T-shirts, and Hill Brodigan allegedly turned off all the lights in her house as paramedics treated the intoxicated minor, forcing responders to use auxiliary lighting to light up the scene. And as bizarre as all of this is and sounds, she wasn't the only school administrator allegedly in attendance. Carly Anderson, third grade teacher, Roosevelt Elementary School, was also at the party, reportedly berated paramedics while visibly intoxicated. And both educators, they were charged with child neglect,
as it should have
delinquency
been,
of a minor, hosting an open house party with alcohol. They were released on bonds of $3,500 and $3,000 respectively, placed on administrative leave. Jeremy, I mean, what do you think is the most shocking or bizarre detail of that case?
I mean, these certainly weren't the chaperones that were on my field trips when I was a kid. But what you have to compare it to in the case that we're talking about, first off, is whenever you have a child that is actually injured, a child that requires medical attention, that's when you start talking about jail time. These things equate to one another. So some people say, well, what kind of penalty you're going to get? Do you think you're going to get jail time? The more serious the injury, the more serious the endangerment, the more likely it is that the prosecutors are going to be seeking to do two things. Number one is make an example out of you publicly in an attempt to provide deterrence to the community. You do this behavior in our community, you will receive a thorough punishment. The second part of it is when you have a child that's injured, it makes it a whole lot easier to, number one, taint a potential jury pool because it's in the news, because now the jurors have heard all of this information. They know who these people are. It's whispers throughout the community, which makes it harder to find people that are going to listen to the evidence and maybe see it in a more favorable way for you. And lastly, because it's so public, it puts the judge in a very precarious position where maybe giving you a sentence that is a little softer, or due to your years of public service where you were a productive member of society, a little more difficult, is the judge wants to also send that message back to the community.
Yeah.
If you endanger our children, you will do jail time. And so
Facts.
in that case,
As you should.
Very possible you're going to jail.
Would you agree with me that when you're looking at these charges of contributing to the delinquency of a minor, child endangerment, they're quite broad? They're not necessarily specific, and that might be for a specific reason, that might be for a strategic reason that was done on purpose, that you want to encompass the whole gamut of what that could be. And, you look at that, and correct me if I'm wrong if it's broad in that fashion, but could that also work to a defense's perspective, that it's too broad?
No, these statutes completely work against the defense. When the legislature builds these statutes, the idea behind the statutory construction is that they wanted to cover everything that we think of, and they wanted to cover some of the activity that we don't think of. Every time we have a new social media app that comes out, every time we have new technology where adults and minors can interact, they wanted to cover all of this stuff so they don't have to continue rewriting the law. But to your point, if it's overbroad and ambiguous, if the conduct isn't clearly defined, as opposed to me just listing different actions that may fall within the statute, then the defense attorney could potentially file a motion to dismiss to say, you know what, I don't think this conduct is actually covered under the statute. And if they raise the constitutionality of that statute on appeal.
Interesting. By the way, when you think about the liability of the schools or the school districts, is there something there? The idea of where was the oversight? Where were the policies? It's tough, right? Because you don't have a crystal ball. You might hire people who are well qualified. How can you expect that they would do something like this? But does the buck not stop with the school or the school districts?
No, it 100% does. You have various layers of liability here because, of course, the school system is going to say, well, that's outside the scope of that teacher's responsibility, so we're not going to cover here. Well, you have some real issues. It's not just the lack of supervision here. The issue is, what are the long-term health consequences of allowing a child to vape? We have now seen medical studies talking about the long-term usage of vaping. And we're not talking about adults who are using it consensually. These children can't be using consensually in a school environment. So are we going to be looking at potentially massive losses by these school districts who are now maybe experiencing underfunding or have funds cut as a result of cases like these? So it causes not only massive civil liability for them, it could also cause a lack of funding.
By the way, before we move on, I have one more case I wanted to talk to Jeremy about. If you're interested in this case, we did a whole deep dive on it on another episode of Sidebar. You can check it out on Law and Crime's YouTube page. But the one more case I want to talk about, because it's kind of related to everything we're focusing on here, is out in Prosper, Texas, where a former preschool teacher was sentenced to prison after 4 one-year-olds in her care actually ate THC gummies.
What?
CBS News, 35-year-old
The
Ashley
hell?
Burks pleaded guilty back in December to 1 count of
And she would have to
manufacturing
be
delivery
black.
of a controlled substance,
I'll
and
be
4 counts
damned.
of injury to a child, and she was sentenced to prison. The incident occurred back on October 31st of 2022 when the toddlers suddenly became ill at the Primrose School of Prosper in Texas. And these toddlers were apparently just 12 to 18 months old.
Ooh,
Doctors
Lord.
confirmed their symptoms were caused by THC. And police identified Burks as the suspect. And on December 6th, she pled guilty to the charges. According to police, she received a 1-year sentence on each of the 4 injury to a child counts and 3 years behind bars for possession of a controlled substance. My gosh, Jeremy, what do you think about the fact that the toddlers were so young? How does that detail shape your perception of that case? And how does it relate to what we've been talking about today so far?
It's interesting you raised that case because earlier in our conversation about these companion cases we've been discussing, I mentioned the fact that scientific testing probably isn't going to be relevant to the determination of the guilt innocence, right? But here, the fact that scientific testing of these children, the blood test to show the presence of THC, is 100% dispositive. But the other thing is what you're seeing in states that have legalized marijuana, states like Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, California, is you're seeing this drug is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. People aren't putting it away. So the next question is going to be, are we going to see bills passed in states that are similar to what are called access to firearms bills, if you're not storing your firearm responsibly? So in these states where we've now legalized marijuana, are we going to see when terrible things like this happen? Or if a child overdoses, although it's obviously not really possible with marijuana, but very possible with other controlled dangerous substances. If you leave your pills out, if you leave your marijuana gummies out, your edibles out, and your child is harmed or something happens to them because they're on drugs, access to firearm right now, they're mostly finable offenses. But if you have a child that overdoses or gets hurt, falls down some stairs, and is
Okay, I got a couple
injured,
more minutes
that
on
person
this.
should go to jail for irresponsible storage. So the real question is, are we going to see the legislature catch up with stories like these
Talk
and pass
about
some
it.
laws to protect children? And promote the responsible use of cannabis in states where it's lawful.
Because in other words, what you're saying is different from South Carolina, right? If someone legally has the right to possess these materials, they can make the argument, look, I had the right, it was an accident, whereas, in South Carolina, it's against the law to use those substances. So that's what you're suggesting, right?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, if you are a parent of a child in any of these cases, what is the potential for you to seek legal recourse? What is the potential legal liability for the teachers, the school districts? Do they have viable claims for lawsuits?
I think the parents of the children who are victims probably have good arguments for negligence. The question is,
very good
what
argument.
immunity exists within the school system? For instance, when you prosecute police officers in civil claims, you have to get to gross negligence, low-level negligence, meaning just making a mistake doesn't do it. You really got to do something beyond the pale. Here, a teacher allowing the students to smoke marijuana, I doubt there's any immunity there. The question would be, what would the damages be? What are the long-term consequences? How are these children harmed such that they should receive, some level of a cash payment? So is there civil liability? Yes. Are there damages? Probably not in a case like this.
What a situation. My gosh, I don't mean to make light of it. It's just sometimes it's so shocking. I even need to take a step back and be like, wow, this is what I'm actually talking about today. Yeah.
Well, we know their jobs are up in smoke.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Scary. It's a scary world. I mean, you're talking about entrusting your children in the care of strangers. That's something else, but look what we're seeing happening in so many schools. Jeremy Eldridge, thanks so much for taking the time. Great speaking to you.
All right, see y'all later.